What's the darkest secret you found out about a family member or relative? My dad was born in rural Texas in 1915. He was the youngest of 10 kids, all a year apart, so his oldest sibling, Henry, was about 11 years older than him. My dad's father died in an accident not long after he was born, so Henry became the man of the house at about age 11. When my dad was about 9 years old, 1924, a gang of men came through their small town, kidnapping children to work as slaves picking cotton about 400 miles away. Apparently this was not an unusual occurrence at the time. My dad and 2 of his siblings were taken. Henry, who was now 18, came home from working on a cattle drive about a week later, and found his mother hysterical about the kidnapping of 3 of her children. Being the man of the house, at age 18, Henry strapped on his father's 6 guns, dual holsters, 1 on each hip, and set out to get his 3 siblings back. He gathered clues about the gang from other townsfolk who also had children stolen. He headed east to where he was pretty certain the kids were taken, riding in empty train boxcars and even on the roofs of moving trains. It took him several weeks, but through talking to locals along the way who heard rumors of child abductions, he finally narrowed down to a few cotton farms where he thought the kids were. My dad, who was 9 years old at the time this happened to him, had tears in his eyes when he told me this part of the story. He and 2 of his brothers, along with about a dozen other kidnapped kids, had been held captive on this cotton ranch for over 2 months, and had given up ever seeing home or the rest of their family again. They were kept locked in a barn, fed scraps, and forced to pick cotton in the hot Texas sun. They were beaten if they cried or refused to work. One day, working in the fields, they heard Henry's voice calling their names. They looked up and saw my Uncle Henry, walking towards them, and they started running toward him, when one of their captors rode up on a horse and started yelling. Henry pulled one of his guns and shot the man dead. My dad wasn't even sure if the man had a gun, and it didn't matter. The gunshot drew a couple more of the rancher/captors over, and Henry killed them both as well. My dad ran up and hugged my uncle, and he told them, "Let's go home." My dad tells me they rode on and in train boxcars all the way back west to their little Texas town, along with a couple other kids that were stolen from the town. When they got back to their small farm, my dad said his mom fainted when she saw them. He said Henry put the 6 guns away, and never touched them again. There was no law enforcement, no investigation about what had happened, that my uncle murdered 3 men to get his siblings back. It was basically still the Wild West in Texas in the 1920s. The boys eventually all joined the Army and Navy, and all served and survived World War II. My dad didn't tell me this story until after Henry had died. I had always known my Uncle Henry as a sweet, soft-spoken, diminutive, about 5'4", maybe 100-pound, man who went on to own a printing shop. I would never have imagined him capable of the feats of heroics he performed, at age 18, to bring his family back together. A few years before he passed, my dad and I had a long heart-to-heart, at the end of which, he told me he wasn't the one to first sleep with my mom on their honeymoon. He caught her in bed with her cousin, with which she had been in love for a long time. He spoke with their pastor, who told him to forgive and forget. That worked until 6 years later, when he caught her again, with the same cousin. He told me he wanted to leave with me but ultimately decided to stay, because he wanted me to have a family. With all that happened in my childhood, and to him, workaholic, diabetes, heart attack, I wish he'd left and be happy instead. My great-uncle is a rapist that prefers underage family members. I don't know how many people actually know, but my grandparents certainly do, along with his victims, my mom, aunt, and I know at least a few or their cousins, but I'm not sure which. But then he found Jesus again, so we all have to forgive him and pretend nothing happened. It was before I was born, but that's the basic runaround I've gotten from my grandparents. They don't ever actually acknowledge it, just that Tony did bad things, but he found God. I eventually put two and two together about my mom's history, her sexual assault, and her making sure that me and my female cousins were never left alone with him. And now that I'm in my 20s, that duty has been passed down to me at every family gathering. It's like an unspoken rule that you can't say why, just the warning. Don't leave your daughters alone with him. I'm tired of it though. Tired of shooing little girls away and having to pretend like it's normal. Scoping toddlers out of a predator's arms and acting like everything's fine and I'm just baby crazy. When this is all over, I'm not going to stay quiet anymore. The next time I have to around him, I'm taking children right back to their parents with the full fucking story of why it's dangerous. I'm tired of having to protect a rapist to keep peace. My biological grandfather threatened to kill my grandmother while she was very young and pregnant with my uncle. Long story short, he was engaged to someone else. My grandmother became a nervous wreck while pregnant and wouldn't leave the house, and he used to throw bricks through the window. Eventually, she told some of her friends about what he'd threatened to do to her. Shortly after that, he went missing, never to be seen or heard from again. We always kind of laughed and joked that one of her friends must have threatened him or ran him out of town. We would even go as far to say someone might have killed him for her. It wasn't until we were going through her boxes of photos and love letters we realized she was actually friends with the Cray twins. My grandpa, who died back in 2017, was a very quiet man and didn't talk a lot. A few years before he died, my mom, his daughter, told me why. Apparently when he was around 10 years old back in the late 30s or early 40s, a girl around his age lived across the street. One time they went out with his rifle to shoot at random things in the woods. On their way home, there was a fence they had to get over to get home. My grandfather leaned his rifle on the fence to help his friend get over the fence since she was a girl. As she was going over, the rifle fell over and went off, killing the girl. After the cops got involved, he was found to not be at fault, but the girl's family stood out in the street at various times over the next 2 weeks, yelling "murderer" at my grandpa's house. He eventually couldn't take it and ran away from home. In his teens, he met this guy named Rocky and befriended him. Rocky was supposedly in his early to mid-20s. Something happened where Rocky ended up passing away and my grandfather took his name. I had always wondered why my grandfather had a different last name than his brothers. Here is where it gets even weirder. My dad was adopted, and until recently, we didn't know anything about his biological family. Well, thanks to all of the DNA tests that have become common, we ended getting connected with his biological family, to include his dad, my dad's dad, who is still alive and in his late 80s. Talking to that part of the family, we have come to find out that my dad's biological dad has almost the same story as my mom's dad. He also had accidentally killed someone as a child, ran away from home and changed his identity. My uncle tells the story that when he was a kid, his older brother wanted him to go out hunting with him in the woods near their house. They woke up really early and started walking much deeper into the woods than they usually did, and way off the normal trails they used. My uncle realized his brother was letting him get further and further ahead. He stopped and turned around to see his brother starting to bring the shotgun up in his direction. He asked him what the hell was he doing. His brother said, "Oh, I thought I saw something." My uncle decided to go back at that point. Later that week, he went back and found a pit that someone had dug a bit further off the trail. He never went anywhere with his brother alone again. Both of them are mom's brothers. The wannabe Kane was a narcissist of the not letting a silly thing like being married get in the way of his dating life variety, who decided he had big dreams and bailed on the family and his wife when I was a kid and proceeded to OD. Thus I usually don't think of him as my uncle, because I didn't have a real relationship with him. Not sure why he didn't shoot my uncle, might have wanted it to look more like an accident, or didn't want to look his brother in the eye. For those saying it's just a story, yeah, I can't prove it, since there were only 2 people there, and one of them is dead now, of the aforementioned OD, but the way that my uncle described it, he was really afraid of his brother and thought he was capable of fratricide. User Avatar, Level 1, Cheercraft. 10M. Edited 10M, helpful, wholesome, Silver 4, hugs. I found out 2 years ago that my mother had a baby she gave up for adoption 18 months before she had me, and then had another baby when I was 3, and she also gave that baby up for adoption. All 3 of us have different fathers, and I think the only reason she kept me was because my father married her, but that marriage only lasted a year. My mother remarried when I was 5, and my half-brother was born when I was 7. As far as I knew, for 59 years he and I were our mother's only children. I never saw her pregnant with the second baby because she sent me to live with my great-grandparents across the country during her pregnancy. My mother and grandmother were the only people who knew about this, and they both took the secret to their graves. The only reason any of it was found out is because of all of the DNA testing people now do. This discovery really impacted my sense of identity for a while, my view of my mother, and our relationship. I've met my half-siblings, an older sister and younger brother. I like them and I'm glad I've been able to answer some of their questions, but the initial discovery really messed with me for a bit. This happened in the mid-late 1950s. Condoms weren't available to teenagers at the time, there was no sex ed, no abortion, only unwed mother homes. She went to one when she got pregnant with my older sister because she was only 16. I don't know how my mother managed her pregnancy with my brother. She would have been around 21 years old and probably made up some story about a dead husband or divorce or something with the help of her mother. I have never done DNA testing, but the half-siblings have, including the one I grew up with, whom I've always called my brother, not half-brother. I think they all did Ancestry. The siblings found other relatives first and made their way to me eventually. I don't think I will ever do DNA testing, I'm done with surprises. The other relatives were the ones who told me about the siblings. The story is even wackier because the relatives were my mother's half-sisters, from the father she never met, that she never knew existed. They found me 8 years ago, after extensive genealogy research. I also have a half-brother from my bio dad whom I met for the first time right before COVID hit. I've known he existed since I was 19 but wasn't able to find him, he found me. I'm 62 now. My adopted siblings were better off. Both my parents and my stepfather are dead. I don't believe my stepfather ever knew about the adopted babies. I think the only other person who knew was my grandmother. For context, my dad is the second youngest of 15 children. My oldest aunt has a son that is around the same age as my dad, we'll call him Vince. Vince and my dad knew each other growing up, always got along. He was even one of my dad's groomsmen. A few years after that, Vince became very openly religious, and would try to get family members to go to church with him. The thing the family started to notice is that he would change which church he would go to after about a month. Fast forward to when I was 1. There was a family get-together. Vince and his girlfriend show up, they start making people uncomfortable with their religious talk. Not the normal day-to-day stuff, but actually telling people they are going to hell for drinking alcohol. Telling people that he is becoming a preacher and they need to attend his services, or else damnation, etc. According to my mom, I was really sick at this time and she took me to another room to give me some quiet and hopefully I would stop fussing. She overheard Vince and the GF in the next room talking about who they can single out and would go along with them. My mom freaked when she heard my dad's name, and Vince saying that he would be easy to convince, and his job should be able to fund things. My mom immediately went and got my dad, told him what she heard. Dad confronts Vince, and a huge argument ensues. Vince ends up leaving and saying everyone is going to hell, they are Satan, etc. The rest of the family then talked about what happened, and then it all came clear that he was not a good guy. His sister had kicked him out because he was mooching off her, refused to get a job, and she found him stealing from her purse. My aunt had to do the same, for the same reasons. The same story over and over. They realized Vince was just a scam artist trying to live off others. Fast forward to the late 1980s, not many people have heard from Vince. There is a huge family get-together and 2 aunts and a few cousins refused to attend because Vince was not welcome. They were saying Vince was the Lion of God, and we are wrong to reject him. Another fight ensues, and the 2 aunts and handful of cousins don't attend. Fast forward to the mid-90s, when my grandma had passed away. One of the 2 aunts comes to the funeral, the other passed away a few years earlier, with Vince in tow. Vince was warned that he could come pay his respects, but to behave himself. My aunt was timid and repressed near him, and was open and nice when he wasn't around. It was really weird. My parents didn't want to talk about it. Later that night, I did some internet searches and found that Vince was the leader of a religious cult. Sucked in my 2 aunts, about 7 of my cousins, and about 30 to 40 various people through the years. All the same thing, they must give up their money and belongings to join and serve God. He especially preyed on immigrants who came over by themselves. Basically, he bought some farmland, his disciples work the land, he sells what they grow/make, and keeps the money. He is still active to this day, and many people who have left him have their own websites against him. My dad has a brother who I've never met, and I didn't even know about his existence until a few years ago. I asked my parents why nobody from the family talks about him and why haven't they invited him to us, but they said, just because. And then we had other relatives over at our house and I heard them talking about him, and it turns out the guy is a criminal and he spent almost all his life in prison, but the worst thing he did is that he was molesting his own daughter, or at least he was accused with it, but my mother and also the half of the extended family believes till this day that his daughter just made it up for attention. Found out the hard way that my grandfather was a sexual predator. Turns out my grandmother had been in denial despite both my aunts, their friends, and young girls in their small town claiming he raped/molested them. One 16-year-old even got pregnant and he paid for the abortion. Grandma lied about his whereabouts/activities for years to protect him because if he went to jail she'd be unable to afford their house. So, long story short, me and my then 10-year-old cousin were his latest and final victims. About 10 years ago, so before Me Too, there was a period of time where quite a few historical sexual assault crimes were in the news, and people were a lot of women talking publicly about their experiences for the first time. That prompted my nan, who I was very close to confess to me that her brother tried to rape her when she was a teenager, so I comforted her and didn't tell anyone. She died a few years ago and I found out then that my dad also knew, which must have been hard for him, except that he thought that she was raped, not that it was attempted. He also implied that one of the reasons his parents divorced was because there were some difficulties with intimacy as a result of her assault. She always had issues with any men that were interested in her romantically, saying she hated men, so it really sucks that she couldn't get any support at the time. She was otherwise great though, had a really full life and lots of friends. Literally a day after my nan's confession I was with my other grandmother who said, "You know, all this stuff in the news is making me remember something that happened to me when I was a young girl, and I got really worried that there was another traumatic event in the family." Turns out, she got flashed on the bus, still awful of course, but after the day before was a bit of a relief.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.